of Krishnamurti. He has been doing The Challenge of Change, which is a biographical film of Krishnamurti's life. And I'm just picking a few because it's so comprehensive. He has been prolific in his projects. But the latest project that he's very proud of is Always Awakening, is a book he did with interviews with Rinpoche. And now he's going to talk and he's going to bring it all together for us. Welcome for Michael.
So I woke up this morning very, very early, trembling, because I had a nightmare. And it was that I was standing in front of a group of relatively aging experts in Krishnamurti. And my job was to do something that would be fresh and perhaps inspiring. So here we are. Yeah, let's see if we can find something that is fresh and hopefully inspiring. And my goal is that it creates a different paradigm, a different perspective to approach this collected thing that we call the teachings. So very briefly, yes, appreciation, because my participation in this pond, in this world that Krishnamurti has created, has certainly changed the course of my life profoundly. And I am daily appreciative of all of the friendships and the interviews and all I've learned on this amazing journey. So, and Evelyn was catalytic in allowing me and encouraging me, and for our friendship and collaboration to be able to do all of these amazing things that I've been able to do. So, bless you, Evelyn, and thank you. I've told her that so many times. So let's talk about what we're doing. So yes, one of the favorite phrases for Evelyn has always been unconditionally free. It's so succinct. It's such a poignant and clear summary of what Krishnamurti's work is all about. And the book, and also Evelyn has had a passion because she loves the experience that the large exhibit creates. And the goal here was, she always wanted to do a small version, a tabletop version that people could actually have at home and so on. And in all honesty, I have always been somewhat resistant to it, because as soon as you squish those panels down small, you can't read the type, and there's so many technical reasons why the experience of the big exhibit, which you actually go inside of, is very different than the one on the tabletop. So the idea of creating something based on the focus of the exhibit in a book form and expanding what the exhibit is intended to do became a project, and that's what we're doing. It's called Unconditionally Free. Krishnamurti in context. Where does his life, how does his life present in the stream of the bigger life of the globe, of the world, of civic and political events that were going on during his life or before? The other theme that is close to me is a statement that Krishnaji made to trustees a long time ago. He says, what's relevant are the teachings. Who the teacher is not relevant. But to investigate who the teacher is, we have to find out if you can grasp the quality of mind of the teacher. Now, I'm using that statement, can we grasp the quality of the mind of the teacher, as the overarching theme that binds this new book project together. This is the anchor for the exploration that this work that we're developing creates. I want to say just a technical note before we jump in. I've packed at least a day's worth of material into this short bit of time that we have. So I don't want to take questions. I want to just keep pushing through. I'm happy to stay after, and if people want to talk and explore implications of any of the things that we're going to be proposing, then I'm happy to deal with questions. But I think that we're going to flush out our time. I'm hopeful that I can even get through the whole thing in the time allotted. So let's go. I'm going to be very brisk in that way. I'm going to not spend a lot of time elaborating, but rather just plant, these ideas one after the other, and hopefully you'll get the collection. So this is the book. Let's just take a second, and I'll show you an illustration of how this thing is working or beginning to get laid out, meaning the book. So a proposed cover, this is one that I like. I have another one that's even more Zen. It doesn't have Kay's image on it. It's just the open sky with the title of the book. And it's just that silent openness, emptiness kind of thing. So we have basically compressed the exhibit into a 2-page spread. The type is bigger, you can read everything. So as the preface to the book, the exhibit is presented in the way that it was set up. I don't do the interior of it, but then it goes into regular text and copy. And then we come after the introduction to each of the decades represented by the book. And here we have just a collage of people and events and things that were going on in the world as a preface to that decade. Invention, machines, protest, slavery, war, exploration, discovery, these things that were going on as a way of giving a context to what was going on. And then on this bottom, when we move into that chapter, as we go into each chapter or each decade, the orange line at the bottom will have highlights of significant events that were going on. So you'll always get this sense of context at the bottom of what was going on in Kay's narratives and discussions about it. So this is in general the format of where we're headed, and I'm very excited about it. I think it's going to be great. So our focus today, I'm taking a quote by David Bohm. We're faced with a breakdown of general social order and human values that threatens stability throughout the world. Existing knowledge cannot meet this challenge. Something much deeper is needed, a completely new approach. I'm suggesting that the very means by which we try to solve our problem is the problem. The source of our problem is within the structure of thought itself. This has always been, since he first said that, this has always been a guiding phrase or insight for me. So then what we're going to talk about, these are kind of the outline of the issues we're going to explore. What unconditionally free actually means. Free of what? We're going to explore what I call a state-specific approach to consciousness. And the core phrase for that, which is kind of an axiom, is form is content. The state of the mind is the form, and that determines the content of the mind. So form is content is a kind of a universal statement. The state of the brain defines its content. We're going to explore what the wrong turn is from that state-specific standpoint. We're going to explore why psychological thought dominates human consciousness. We're going to look at a little neuroscience about what I call the bonded or unbonded brain. We're then going to talk a little bit about why it is apparently so difficult to experience directly what Krishnamurti is pointing to. What is Krishnamurti's core insight or insights? The psychological forces that conspire to distract us from experiencing directly what he's talking about. And then 3 practices that came from my dialogues and conversations with Samdang Rinpoche, which to me help put the whole teachings into a context that I think is breathtakingly clear. So the goal today for me is to shift attention from superficial content of what we call the teachings to a deeper level, which is the state of the mind. This shift of state is actually the transformation that's really being pointed to. Exploring and studying the teachings without this shift or state, we actually stay where we are, kind of treading water, thinking that we're going someplace, if that makes sense. So these are the key issues that we're going to jump into, and let's begin with unconditionally free. Free of what? So we all know this idea of the full cup or an empty cup. That metaphor has been used classically for a long time. So a full cup doesn't have any room in it for anything else. So the whole idea of emptiness is that an empty cup is open. It's not closed, confined. So let's go to a video clip with David.
That's why it's very important to understand not the mind, but my conditioning. Then whether that my conditioning, the human conditioning, can ever be dissolved. That's the real issue.
We don't really understand the nature of our thought process. We're not aware of how it works, and it's really disrupting not only our society and our individual lives, but also the way that the brain and nervous system operate, making us unhealthy or perhaps even subtly damaging the system. And now, Krishnamurti recognizes that thought, rational, orderly, factual thought, such as in proper doing science, is necessary and valuable, but the kind of thought that he has in mind is self-centered thought. That is, now, at first sight, one might wonder why self-centered thought is so bad. If the self were really there, then perhaps it would be correct to center it on the self, because the self would be so important. But if the self is a kind of illusion, at least the self as we know it, then to center our thought on something illusory, which is assumed to have supreme importance, is going to disrupt the whole process, and it will not only make thought about yourself wrong, it will make thought about everything wrong, so that thought becomes a dangerous and destructive instrument.
So thought becomes a dangerous thing. This little statement by David is so concise, right? So what he's really defining are 2 different qualities of thought. He's saying that there's an objective thought, and then there's what I call psychological thought. He says thought around the nature of the self-image. So you have these 2 qualities of thought that are going on. Kay and David were quite clear that distinguishing between the 2, and I think David is quite right when he says that Kay is focusing on psychological thought. So unconditionally free to Krishnamurti, if I can be so presumptuous, is the freedom, complete freedom from psychological thought. Not emptying it or trying to push it away, but the negation of it. It's not active, it's not on, it's like a switch. Sometimes psychological thought is active, and sometimes it's not. And when you look into research on optimum states, what people call the flow or the zone, one of the hallmarks of it, as Krishnaji says, is complete attention. When there's complete attention, there's an absence of psychological thought. There's no observer, he said. So making this distinction, being very clear about this distinction between objective thought and psychological thought is critical in understanding what the teachings are about and are focusing on. So what is objective, or what is objective thought? What's that sound? Is it going to rain today? How do I get to the market? Basically, there's a challenge, and thought jumps in and basically helps us resolve the challenge, how to bake some cookies or change the tire on a car. So it comes when there's a challenge and it disappears. It's not there all the time. It just comes like a tool when it's necessary. And when it's not necessary, you're back to emptiness. You're back to silence, is the way that I think Kay would talk about it. Now, so I said objective thought is like proper science, as David talks about. It's neutral, it's relatively factual. 3/4 of a cup is 3/4 of a cup, using the baking muffins kind of thing. Now, the critical point, going back to David's statement that we don't actually understand the nature of our thought process. The thought process is so fast that it's actually happened before you're even conscious of it. So by the time you become conscious of what you're thinking, that thought has already gone. I mean, it's already, you're always watching. We are aware of the shadow from a nanosecond or neural sense standpoint. We're not present enough with it because it happens so fast. Much of the thought process that we talk about is associative and is reflexive. So there's these reflexive things going on rather mechanically that we think of as thinking, but it's mechanical, as they went into in quite great depth. So because we are not sensitive enough and fast enough to know what the thought process is doing, psychological thought can creep in. I'm making the muffins. Oh, mom walks in. What is she going to think about me when I'm making the muffins? Are they going to be any good? So psychological thought and the objective thought can happen simultaneously, interchangeably, and we're not generally aware of the nature of what's going on up there. So we kind of relate to them the same, if you will, and they can, one, you can be objective, and then you're going to move into the psychological realm. All right, so psychological thought. What will they think of me is my simple way of identifying the nature of psychological thought. So what are they going to think about me while I'm doing whatever I'm doing? Now, thought that's an abstraction. As David said, the entity that's worried about this is an abstraction. And now you've got this abstraction of an abstraction. So you get this compounding interest of the psychological thought realm. So the process creates this appearance of a center. That it's an appearance, it's an image. And that image is implicit any time you actually feel threatened in any way. Now, that threat could be an actual threat that somebody comes in and threatens you in some way, but it can also be a projected threat or an anticipated threat, some threat that you conjure in a reflexive fashion. So if you're brought up in a threatening environment of any kind, then that psychological thought will be triggered and activated. And we'll go into this a little bit more because it's really quite important. Accurate, correct definition. To navigate the threats implicit in culture, one develops the ego as a coping strategy. Now, but you have this appearance of a center, so we get confused in there very quickly because the coping pattern takes on a persona as an independent entity, and so on and so forth. So this capacity to imagine gets so self-entwined, right? It's like a house of mirrors. And that's what we call our ego, and why David felt that, as he said, it becomes a dangerous thing because we're not aware of what this whole imaginative image-making process is doing in the psychological thought realm, which is fundamentally different from objective thought. So keeping those things clear really helps in approaching Krishnamurti's work. Conformity, acceptance, nonconformity, rejection, abandonment, being observed and judged. Both punishments and rewards in our culture represent threats. So the whole self-identity, the ego, and culture actually emanate from the same psychological or mental source. Culture and self are different, looking at through the telescopes from different ends, right? Is that clear? This is so important because, as Kay said, the inner is the outer. We think that culture is out there, but culture and self-image are reciprocal dynamics. They're actually two sides of the same coin. So you have to be unconditionally free is to be free from both self-image and the image that culture is. Both. And if you look at Kay's teachings and how he described himself, he was not of a nation, he was not of this. So he was free of both. And being free of psychological thought is to be free of that, which is, when you think about it, quite a nice set of freedoms, I think. So, living with constant threat of judgment, comparison, punishment, and rewards very early not only creates psychological thought, but it sets it as the default mode for what we call waking consciousness. Very early, the constant threat that culture represents, the external world of being observed and judged and punished and rewarded, sets up in the developing child's brain the psychological self as being the default for what we call consciousness. Now we can jump forward to Kay's statement, the content of consciousness is consciousness, and now we see that the content of consciousness is state-specific. Does that make sense? Are you following with that? So to look at Kay's work from a state-specific perspective simplifies the whole thing. The cup of attention is always full when the need for psychological threat is ever present. Psychological threat is a misuse of memory. And I love this. I woke up this morning saying, well, it's kind of like using a hammer to scramble your eggs. It's a misuse of the tool of objective thought. Thought no longer understands its limitations, which is a constant theme. Thought is limited. It works fine in some realms, but as soon as it starts to spill over into other realms, it goes into psychological thought, and the whole mess goes there. So psychological thought is like making scrambled eggs with a hammer. And but look at that. Look at what that's going to do to us. So what are the attributes, really, of psychological thought? It is subjective. It's not simple. It's not neutral. Self-centered comparison, judgments, fear, anxiety, envy, pride, shame, jealousy, greed, narcissism, exploitation, aggression, tribalism, nationalism, racism, arrogance, anger, cowardice, dependence, bullying, depression, insecurity, competition, egotism, manipulation, vengeance, paranoia, persecution, rejection, shyness, possessiveness, violence, and more. All of those attributes are implicit in the realm of psychological thought. None of those are there and active when thought is being used correctly, objectively, scientifically, as Kay or as David noted in his talk. You see the difference now between psychological thought and objective thought. And how, if as soon as, and because we're not clear about being able to distinguish between those two, one spills over and then the psychological comes in, we're happy, we're doing, everything's fine, and then something threatens us and psychological thought comes in, and it just gets to be totally messy, and we're not aware of, we can't distinguish between those things. All the attributes above are implicit in the realm of psychological thought. Activation of psychological thought invokes the potential for all of those qualities to express. How they express, which one of those attributes and how they express is our personal coping strategy, right? So you're going to be shy, you're going to be aggressive, you're going to be manipulative, et cetera, so each person's coping style you will adapt these attributes to navigate the threats of culture in your own unique way, based on your body and temperament and the epigenetic quality of how you evolve. Now, the secure or bonded psyche does not need a coping strategy, right? And we'll go into this notion of what bonded means, but basically it means I'm safe and secure. Bonded means I'm safe and secure. If you're totally safe, you're not threatened. You don't need a coping strategy, and you're going to use thought objectively. You're not going to evoke the psychological thought realm. So the bonding, the feeling safe and secure is bonding. If you look at the school, the very core of Krishnamurti's approach to education is to be psychologically secure, to not be threatened by the environment, which doesn't evoke the ego, doesn't evoke the psychological thought realm, and you can then take all that energy that's being invested in defense, you can invest it into inquiry and wonder and curiosity and grow and grow and grow and grow. But as soon as the psychological threat kicks in, all that energy and attention that would go into growth goes into protection. And learning is stunted and performance is stunted. Okay. So, form is content. The state of the mind defines its content. So I'm suggesting that there are, when we're shifting to this state-specific model, what are they? What are the states? Well, as we've said, there's silence and emptiness, which keeps our doors of perception open to vast, unknown possibilities. There is objective thought. How do I get from here to there? How do you paint the picture? How do you do this? How do I navigate mechanically, the world? And then there's psychological thought, which we've just covered. So these are three primary states. But there's more than that. So, at first I said, well, there's only three. But then I thought, no, it's much deeper than that, because what about the other states that we would call the non-ordinary states? Telepathy, clairvoyance, insight, and more. Keep in mind that what we call normal waking consciousness represents cognitive. Our cognitive reality represents only 5% of our total neural processing or capacity. But it's with that 5% that we try to control the world, right? Control ourselves, control others. It's all within that 5%. So just as infrared and microwave and gravity and other fields of meaning are real, they're quite real, but not perceived by the sensory system, the same is true of what we can call consciousness. Carl Pribram, who was a professor of psychology at Stanford many years ago, described how the human brain translates non-local quantum fields of meaning in the same way that a television set translates a television broadcast. And those signals are then transformed into sensory experience that the brain can realize and see and work with. So we have this vast, vast potential that the brain actually translates. I was talking with Javier Rodriguez this morning about the savant. The savant is a wonderful example of a physical brain translating non-local fields that were not learned, and the savant is completely accurate with how they do this. The oracular tradition has always looked at, being able to communicate or to reach out or be influenced by the other, whatever name metaphorically we give it. So that's just a recognition that that even objective thought is very limited. There's much more to our capacity than just what we cognize and are conditioned in our mechanical ways to do. And so there are windows to this. There are windows to this other potential. The problem is that when psychological thought is chronically active, there's no room for that other savant-like display, or what Kay and Bohm would call insight. Insight is a savant-like experience. So insight isn't possible in a cup that's full of psychological defensive thought. So you need to be free of that to allow the insight to emerge. And if you do have the insight, if psychological thought is active when that insight emerges, or even after it has emerged, if psychological thought is present, it's going to twist and distort that insight in its translation. Does that make sense? Now, this, in a nutshell, is a big problem of the early theosophical movement and so on. And what a great deal of what Kay rebelled against was the activity of the ego to potential insights. When he said they took something magnificent and shrank it down, this is what he's referring to. It was the activity of the psychological self on the vast potential of insight and inspiration. So therefore, I just added this morning. Inquiry, therefore, is a state. Inquiry is a state, not a question. We tend to turn inquiry into a question. The Kay and Bohm dialogues and so on started, well, what do you want to talk about, right? They started with a question. But at a much deeper level, at a state-specific level, it's not the question that is the inquiry. The inquiry is the state of childlike wonder and curiosity and passion. Now, the child lives in that state. And out of that state, the question can emerge, what's this, or what's that, or what about that, or how does it work? But you can very easily see that you could have the question, you could start with the question, well, what do you think about this? And not have the state of wonder and true curiosity. You can have the question, which is just cognitive, without the embodied state of curiosity and wonder. And from a state-specific standpoint, looking at Kay's material, he's talking about the state of wonder being inquiry. And I think this is really an important realization. So, the wrong turn. You all are familiar with that phrase. This comes from the first of the, I think, 1980 conversations between David and Kay, the ending of time. This was the question that kind of prompted or was the catalyst for those dialogues. What is the wrong turn? We must have made some wrong turn. Was the question that started all of that. And I'm suggesting that accepting the appearance of an assumed thinker or center as an independent reality. In other words, that's the essence of the wrong turn, is the failure to grasp that this assumed ego or psychological entity is independent from thought. That is the wrong turn. This came in with the capacity to imagine. As the capacity to imagine expanded, this assumption, this image making capacity just grew so fast that we lost track of what was going on in the image making capacity. And we mistook our own fabrications as something independent, and we're like a dog chasing its tail, but we don't think our tail is me. We think the tail is something independent from me, and so we get lost chasing our tail. And that's essentially the wrong turn, which compounded into racism and tribalism and all these beliefs. And you can just see this fundamental not knowing the nature and structure of the thought process snowballing and compounding every generation. So the next one is, and this is really beautiful, assuming that the assumption that psychological thought is a means for psychological mutation or transformation. In other words, this goes back to David's first statement that thought can't correct itself. He said society, we're faced with a breakdown of social structure and so on and so forth that's threatening life on the planet. And he says the problem is in the structure of thought. And he said thought can't fix it. And that's what this statement here is referring to. So what really brought that to my attention years ago was this dear woman. We were in India.
It has been said that Krishnamurti began where Buddha ended. Buddha is supposed to have brought rationality into spirituality. Krishnamurti goes beyond, and he shows us the limitations of thought as a means of psychological mutation. And he shows that pure perception, which is not related to time or to thought, acts. And that perception which acts, that breaks away the pattern of the brain, in which human being has been caught over 1 million years, repeating the same thing over and over again.
This is so condensed and so concise. Would you like to hear it again? Yeah. This is homeopathy. This is so concise. I mean, and you know, we sat across the table, and she said this to me. I says, you know, who are you and what are you doing? We're just having tea, and she said that, and I said, wait. And I brought out I took her outside, and I said, say that again, would you? And this is what she said. This is so essence.
It has been said that Krishnamurti began where Buddha ended. Buddha is supposed to have brought rationality into spirituality. Krishnamurti goes beyond, and he shows us the limitations of thought as a means of psychological mutation. And he shows that pure perception, which is not related to time or to thought, acts. And that perception which acts, that breaks away the pattern of the brain, in which human being has been caught over 1 million years, repeating the same thing over and over again.
So I want to emphasize the insight that this means to me. First, again, we don't understand the nature of our own thought process. That's really critical. Number two, he shows, meaning Krishnamurti shows, the limitation of psychological thought as a means for mutation or transformation. Now, this is very similar to what David was saying, that it's in the structure of thought itself, and that that thought can't do this. It's something that thought simply cannot do. And it's part of not realizing the limitations of the thought process fundamentally, and she says this too. So it's not recognizing the inherent limitations of where thought works well and where it does not. We are not sufficiently acute in our distinction between those two to allow this amazing, powerful mechanism to work. And because of that failure for discrimination between where thought works well and it doesn't, we not only create the entity, but then we try to use the same process to fix the entity, and it's again a house of mirrors. It just compounds itself in confusion. And David said he felt that process of that psychological echo chamber was disturbing the fundamental brain itself. It was creating a quality of brain damage. So the more we try to fix ourselves using the source of our problem, the more the brain is damaged, is his proposal. So I think that's pretty important. So let's go on and hear the same thing in a different way.
I remember an occasion when a Jain monk walked up, travel weary. Must have been about 11 o'clock in the morning, and Krishnaji was just going in for his bath. And he said he had been walking for weeks to get there because he learned that Krishnaji was there. And said it was very urgent that he should see him. And he told Krishnaji that he had been at this game for 14 years, and he said that he was feeling a bit despair. And he thought that if nothing was coming out of it, there was no point in going on living. And he had a sense of urgency that he must find a solution. And Krishnaji smiled and he said, you are trying to find an answer, aren't you, sir? You are trying to find a solution. He said, I would rather change this process and merely look at what you are trying to do with yourself. Look at what thought is trying to do to itself. So he said, the thought is trying to persuade itself and pressurize itself to stop its operations because it wants to get something out of it. And this is something which thought can't do. So you have just to grasp the single fact that what you have been trying to do for 14 years is something which thought has been trying to do, and there is just no way by which thought will ever be able to do it. Just see this, the finality of it, that it is not within the capability of thought to do what you want thought to do. Just see this. Do you see this, sir, what I am saying? The monk was impressed and he said, yes, I do. But he said, you are trying to ask thought to do it for you. Don't do that. That you just watch what thought is doing to itself. And perhaps if you do that and wait, and suddenly there was a change in the appearance of the monk. He closed his eyes and he was quite silent. And after about 4 minutes, he opened his eyes and his eyes were full of tears. And he touched Krishnaji's feet. And then he said that, sir, I have been wanting to get this for a long time and I have not been doing it. So thank you and I'll go. He said, no, don't be in such a hurry. Please sit down for 5 minutes. The monk sat down. He sat quietly, but suddenly he blurted out, sir, I have one more question to ask. He said, of course, I am waiting for that. And he said, well, that was all right. Really, thought was absolutely quiet without my doing anything about it. But how can it last? How can I get it again? And Krishnaji said, that is just the question that I knew you were going to ask me. He said, but who is it that asked the question? The mind that's silent is asking this question, or the mind that was not able to get silent and worrying over it that is asking the question? It is again the old mind. You have gone back to the old mind, and that old mind is asking this question because it wants to possess what you got, it wants to hold on to it and continue it. All this is the normal function of thought. When you had moved out of that room and now you want the answer in this room, that is, you want the answer to be with thought. Do you see what you are doing? Do you see, sir, what thought is doing to you? Do you see what thought is doing to itself? And again the monk went silent. And this time he was silent for a while. And he opened eyes that were full of peace. And he touched Krishnaji's feet and said, sir, I will not come to you again. Krishnamurti was insistent that man must understand that there is a part of his development which is achieved through knowledge and memory and reason and thought and reflection. And there is also a point at which he sees the limits of this, the limit of thought, and to see that thought creates the problem and cannot solve all the problems that it creates.
It doesn't get much clearer than that, I don't think. I think that when we see the synergy of the perspectives that are being offered here, it's rather breathtaking. So how does the wrong turn become compounded? We don't understand the nature of the thought process. We assume that thought, the psychological thought which creates the problem, can solve the problem. Now, at a deeper level, I add that we fail to understand that culture and the individual's ego are the same fields, the same thing. They arise from the same source. They are reciprocal, dynamic, and as the scientific axiom says, you know, you can't solve a problem at the level of the problem. This is basically what we're talking about. That's basically what Achyut just said. Thought can't do this. So also what I think is important about this is that implicit in what Achyut just said so clearly is what I'm referring to as a state-specific understanding of what this is about. The shift of state in the monk that generated his first peace and tears was a shift of state. It had nothing to do with content or cognition. Content, the cognitive process came to an end. And that was the silence or the peace that gave him what he was looking for. And then the psychological state turned on again and said, oh, well, how do I get it back? How do I keep it? Shift of state. It was off, and then it came on again. And the dog chased its tail until Krishnaji pointed out that that's exactly what he was doing. And in Achyut's final statement, he said, it's a normal and custom, thought operates correctly in this field, in this area. But as soon as it spills over into this other area, which is, I'm saying, psychological thought, it creates all these problems that it can't fix. So it's a state, it's an embodied state. What we're really, the essence of the teachings is a state of the mind, not its content. And to use an embodied state as a reference as we listen and explore the teachings, to me, is breathtakingly fresh. Analysis and all of that, he's just continually pointing to this state describing it in 1,000 different ways. Now, I'm going to suggest, and we'll go into this, it is much more difficult today for our deeply conditioned psychological default state to experience what Krishnaji has been talking about. It's much more difficult today than ever before in history. And let's explore that a little bit, because in terms of what the mission is of the foundation and so on and so forth, this is a pretty important statement. If our the challenge is getting steeper, it's not getting easier for Krishnamurti's insights to be lived. And I want to drop back and look a little bit about why psychological thought dominates human consciousness. And I want to look at it from a developmental standpoint. And now we're going to, bring back in this bonding issue. Bonding describes a biological and therefore psychological security. That's what we mentioned earlier. That it's a sense of safety. It's a sense that I belong here. I'm safe here. This is where I'm at. And within that, you don't need the psychological defense posture, which evolves into psychological thought and the ego. You don't need an ego if you're totally safe. It actually doesn't exist. With complete attention, there's no observer. So with complete attention, you're totally safe, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't need the whole psychological thing. Bonding is developed empathically. The model imperative, as my colleague Joseph Chilton Pierce used to describe it, or epigenetics, which is this new brain research and DNA thing, no bonding, no empathy. Failure to experience and develop the capacity for empathy creates trust bandits. Now, a trust bandit was defined in a book called High Risk, Children Without Conscience. So if your default identity is the psychological realm instead of the bonded realm, then your defense mechanism kidnaps your intellect. Your need for defense kidnaps your intellect, and you have to think of yourself as not having the capacity for empathy. Right? You don't empathize with the other. There's no empathy for the other person. That's the children without conscience phenomena. And then when somebody comes along to be exploited, which is the only reason to relate to them is so that you can exploit them, then you see their empathy as a weakness to be exploited. Does that make sense? This is a psychological profile that Ken, and I wrote to him and spoke with him way back then about this. So this was a new phenomena. And in his book, he described how, a 4-year-old child would push a 3-year-old into the swimming pool and watch them drown, and they would then eat their lunch and go on. This is what he meant by a child without conscience, the absence of empathy. Now, what I'm proposing is that there have been changes in childhood, in what we call the state of childhood, which has increasingly produced children without empathy. And with this as a backdrop. So let's look at how that unfolds a little bit, because it's how do we live without psychological thought means that this issue is at the heart of it. If we create environments that are continually threatening for children, they're going to develop that psychological center, and it's going to be fundamentally exploitive with all of those attributes that we talked about before. If you develop an empathic orientation or default, then you have a completely different brain. Literally, the brain is wired differently if you have a bonded brain or if you have an unbonded brain. And there are forces conspiring in the change in the world that we call childhood that is leading more towards the psychological disassociated brain than the empathic one. So using some of the research in child development, We have innate capacities. We have vast innate capacities, and each one of those capacities is evoked and then developed by our interaction with the environment. So this, again, is epigenetics. The environment triggers how you genetically express. So the environment determines how the brain grows. And this issue of safety and empathy are at the root of what we were going to call the bonded brain. So we have two distinct brains. The bonded brain is based on psychological safety, basic trust, affectionate touch, and authentic play. Nature opens and develops the newest evolutionary structures, the prefrontal cortices, the center for altruism, holistic values, and compassion, when nurtured in an environment filled with psychological security, basic trust, affectionate touch, and authentic play. The prefrontals are activated and opened when the environment triggers that, and the prefrontals actually grow, or opened and they grow. Now, in the absence of that, in a threatening environment where the psychological default is dominant, the prefrontals are retarded or don't open, and they don't develop. And this has been Alan Shore's work, monitored this and so on and so forth. So this is not just my conjecture. This is scientifically shown that the higher evolutionary structures are dependent on this early environment that we call nurturing. With nurturing, the prefrontals open, and then you perceive the world with an empathic, altruistic, and compassionate way. If those prefrontals don't open and are not developed, then you become a trust bandit. Now, this is a very simplistic way of saying it, but it's just to make the point. Obviously, there are gray scales in here. So the unbonded, what I call predator brain, feeling threatened, lack of basic trust, sensory deprivation, being over-controlled, being observed, compared, judged, and punished, fails to open and develop the prefrontals. The higher transpersonal capacities are not activated. They were innate potentials, but they needed to be activated and triggered by a model in the environment, epigenetically then triggering the DNA to express those higher capacities. The assumption was that DNA went ahead and expressed mechanically. Well, we now know that that's not true. And that validates this notion that you have two distinct brains going on now. You have an empathic brain and you have a disassociated, isolated predator brain. Please take a look at your political structure today and guess which of those two brains are active. Not having these altruistic, compassionate capacities, the unbonded brain is blind to these values. And having no other reference than selfishness, the unbonded intellect and emotions see caring for others, altruism, and compassion as a weakness to be exploited. Now again, the maladapted brain was glorified by Ayn Rand, the virtues of selfishness, and her court, which we will talk about a little bit later. I refer to them as the club. Others refer to them as the elites. There's a reason why they have been very successful at aggregating power and money and control, because that's all they know. They don't know the compassion and empathy that we feel is the important thing. And now when you have a strategy of negotiating, if you realize that that brain is colorblind to these very human qualities that we hold most dear, you're actually going to negotiate with this character in a different way. Because you're not going to treat him as though you can't use any empathic or these human values, because they don't exist in that brain. So Joe Pierce and others are saying interference. Well, where did this really kick off? Interference with the physical biological bond with the mother, which, according to nature's design, is the safe place, triggers the chronic need for coping strategies and a corresponding activation of psychological thought with its assumed center. That's why K's work is more difficult to embody today than ever before, because the power and the strength and the development of that psychological thought has grown as the bond with the mother and family and early childhood has diminished. At age 2 and 3, when language in there appears, also psychological time, the physical threats of infancy become psychological anxiety. So the child no longer needs to physically be threatened. They produce their own threat by projecting and anticipating the next threat. Does that make sense? So by anticipating, every time that anticipated threat is evoked, the psychological thought center becomes stronger. And that becomes the dominant baseline for what we call consciousness. Whereas K lived in a different state. His was emptiness. And this distinction with the dominant baseline, when K used thought, it was done, he went back to emptiness. When we use thought and it's done, we go back to more thought, right? How am I going to do this when I'm, because of this reciprocal dynamic. Two different brains, two different default states. Consequences of not living the teachings or not embodying what K spent his whole life inviting us to discover. So one of Rinpoche's brilliant observations, exploiting egos is the source of all of our problems. This is living in the house of mirrors or the realm of hungry ghosts. Egos exploiting egos, right? You're living in this hallucination, and you're treating it as though it's real, and you're acting on all of these images that the brain has created, which are basically the chasing your tail and not knowing that that's what you're doing, and harming yourself and others in the process, and most certainly the environment. So predator corporations such as Exxon, Big Pharma, predator rapists, sociopath, and Rand. And again, research has shown that Ronald Reagan, Thatcher, Greenspan, neoconservatives. Madeleine Albright wrote a book called Fascism, A Warning, where she described fascism as being a temperament, a psychological temperament, not necessarily a form of government. And she did a brilliant job of looking at that, which ties directly into what we're talking about. The fascist brain is the unbonded brain. It doesn't have the capacity for any of these things that we're talking about. And here comes Maria Montessori, and this was one of Joe Pierce's favorite quotes. A humankind abandoned in its earliest formative stages becomes its own greatest threat to its survival. And I'm currently reading this book, Faltered, by Bill McKibben. And he wrote a book 30 years ago called The End of Nature, and a number of other books. One of them was called Enough. And he's quite keen on both the environmental crisis, climate change, as well as technology being our savior, our salvation. He questions that fundamentally. And genetic engineering and artificial intelligence are now conspiring. Those two forms of technologies are conspiring to literally put an end to the human experience as we know it. And that's independent of climate change. So we have climate change threatening us globally with mass extinction, and we're at the top of the list. And we have science and technology, from Bill's perspective, threatening the very nature of the human experience. Now, Krishnaji's orientation would have none of this, right? So if you look at the snowball effect that we've been talking about of not being able to understand and embody what Kay spent his whole life talking about, because we failed to grasp the essence of what he was pointing out, which was a big surprise to him, this is what we're looking at. So let's let's go to Sunanda. I made a statement that this well, actually, I skipped one of these videos, so let's look at this video with Kay. It's a little out of sequence, but
What we are trying, all these discussions and talks here, is to see if we cannot radically bring about a transformation of the mind. Not accept things as they are. Nor revolt against it. Revolt doesn't answer a thing. But to understand it, to go into it, to examine it, give your heart and your mind with everything that you have to find out, a way of living differently. But depends on you and not somebody else. Because in this there is no teacher, no pupil. There is no leader. There is no guru. There is no master, no savior. You yourself are the teacher and the pupil, you are the master, you are the guru, you are the leader, you are everything.
The speaker is Krishnamurti.
That noise of a motor.
He is a man who cannot be placed in a simple category like philosopher or religious leader. He is, however, one of the more challenging and creative men of our time. Born in South India in 1897 and educated in England, he has followed a singular and original path of thought free of factionalism and dogma. This is the first of 8 half-hour programs, and the first time that Krishnamurti has allowed his talks and private conversations to be filmed.
And when you put that question, because you are serious, because you are intent, then you are aware of the whole process of the observer, which means you are totally attentive, completely attentive. And in that attention there is no border created by the center. And when there is complete attention, there is no observer. The observer comes into being only when in that look there is inattention, which is distraction. We have put away the observer, and therefore there is attention from it lasts a second. That's good enough. Don't be greedy to have more. In that greed to have more, you've already created the center. And then you are caught. In that attention, there is no seeking at all. And therefore there is no effort. So the mind becomes extraordinarily alert, active, silent. Such a mind is the religious mind. And such a mind has an activity totally different, at a different dimension, which thought can never possibly reach.
so he made the observation in this, which is, he says, revolt is meaningless. Right? And he carried that over to some of his ideas and thoughts and observations about political action. My take on that is, the reason it's meaningless is because you stayed in the same state, right? right? You're still on this side of the wall. You're still on this side. So throughout all of those statements that he made, this jumping back and forth between the states are implicit in what we're talking about. So state is, to me, very, very important. It's the essence of what he's talking about, is the state of the mind, not its content. So a couple things. I said that it's more difficult today than ever before in history to embody what Kay is talking about, and I want to share with you why I believe that. And it has to do with being observed. Being observed. And this is part of what the, let me see if I can bring this up over here. So yeah, being observed. So in birth, when the mother is giving birth, if she feels observed, if somebody's in the room watching, then that observation of being observed represses the natural production of oxytocin, which is an opiate and an ecstatic kind of natural response. So, and what is evoked is the neocortex. So the neocortex, evoking the neocortex, represses what you would call this natural love hormone, or love, or the bonding, or the safe place. So you can see that even hormonally, you have this duality of states. You have being observed, triggering the psychological defense mechanism, and then you have the natural bonded experience and so on that we're talking about. We live in a surveillance state. The more we're observed, which means compared and judged, and all the attributes of psychological self, the more psychological thought dominates. So just being observed, if we just look at childhood or human development just from being observed, it used to be that the kids would go out and play all day. They weren't hovered over. They weren't looked at. They went out and played, right? The parents, I rode my bicycle all over. Did all kinds of stuff. Completely, I wasn't observed. I was free, and that has shifted, as many of you know who know the changes in childhood and development. That has changed fundamentally. Children are observed and controlled and scheduled and so on and so forth all the time. My proposal is that being observed in all of its various manifestations evokes psychological thought. And it becomes more dominant. It becomes the dominant thing. So the absence of free play, Little League being, sports, competitive sports, all of these various things conspire to build that ego structure and have it be the dominant thing. I want to go down, I did say that, growing in environments free of judging and comparing and observation. At the Oak Grove, for example, imagination is free to open up and explore without the neurotic psychological self distorting all of that. So the presence, switching on psychological self distorts all the other activities, or the learning and things that are going on. So the essence of K in education is to create this environment where that psychological self is not evoked, and that is dependent on the environment, which means the teachers and the parents. So the teachers and the parents need to be free themselves in order to create a free environment for that child to not need to defend themselves and build that ego, which then distorts their whole life, and then the planet, right? So the focus for Kay, quite rightly, was on the parents and teachers. If we do parents and teachers right, the children grow up perfectly. We're the problem, not the kids, but we tend to organize ourselves to try to fix the kids when we're the problem. And that's what Kay addressed that straight up. Now, what I want to say is psychological thought means that you are fundamentally isolated. The psychological thought is isolated. It is not connected. It doesn't have empathy. It's a defense structure. So the greater psychological thought is evoked, the more isolated we feel instead of connected. And that ripples into the degradation of the environment and the predator kind of society, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So suicide is the fourth leading cause of death of children 10 to 14. Now, Joe looked at this quite carefully. Children as early as 3 have been documented. It's not reported, but children as early as 3 have committed suicide, straight out, because of the despair implicit in the psychological thought realm, because it's isolated. So, your drug abuse is related to this. And the one what I want to talk about is social media. Social media and the computers that we're using today evoke the psychological thought realm. So the average person spends 116 minutes, nearly 2 hours a day. 16 to 24-year-olds spend 3 hours a day on social media. And this is in addition to the implicit comparisons in school and home and church and competitive sports and the general culture, which are going to trigger it. So we've created this new technology that actually reinforces the evocation and need for that psychological self. And it's on 24/7. And all of the current research says that the more time that a child spends with a screen, the unhappier they are. The more time that a child spends with a screen, the unhappier they are. So those are some of the reasons why I say that the challenge to live what Krishnamurti is talking about is greater than it's ever been before. So sitting at lunch at Brockwood, I was filming The Challenge of Change, and Kay leaned over and he said, "Well, sir, do you think this movie's going to make any difference?" And I was stunned, and I sat there for a minute, and I said, "Well, I don't know, but we should try." He accepted that and went on. That was the only, of course, that's where he lived, right? I don't know if it's going to make any difference, but we have to try. So I think that that's implicit here. The brain filled with psychological thought is blind and delusional and self-destructive to itself and others. Back to Maria Montessori's quote. This implies a chronic and pervasive misuse of memory. This is Alan Anderson's statement. We met and we talked, and that's what he shared with me. The essence of this whole big mess is a misuse of memory, which is what David was talking about. We don't know the very nature and structure of our own thought process. Kay's core insight, there's another state where psychological thought is not active, which is insight intelligence. Being chronically filled with psychological thought, we fail to perceive that other, right? It's negated. The other state is negated because psychological thought dominates. So, why is it apparently so difficult to do this? This is our conclusion. I'm going to need an extra 15 minutes to finish, so I'm not going to not let you out, so you can't go until we do this. Let's look at Sunanda.
Speaking, I absolutely fell in love with him, with the teachings, and it meant a complete change in my life. But apart from that, he was a delight to go with. He will joke with you, he will talk with you, you can go for walks with him, you can correct. He used to sit and edit his works, you can sit by him, such fun it was being with him. He enjoyed being with you. In the 50s, I would say roughly by the end of the 50s, this personal factor gradually started dimming. Later on, I found he became very severe, very serious rather. And then onwards, there was very little of the personal in him. And as years went by, one could see that he was deeply concerned with the state of humanity. Why is it not changing? 50 years he has taught, he has spoken, he has traveled all over the world. Why is not a single person transformed? He was deeply concerned with this problem, with this situation rather. And therefore, there was no place for personal factor, personal relationship. And all of us who had known him knew that personal element had no longer any place. It was only to the extent to which you were aware, you had a different terrain of mind, that you could talk with him, dialogue with him. And this continued through the years.
So it's of course controversial to say that nobody got it. We're not going to go into that right now, but the fact that he made it so obvious. I mean, when you really get what he's talking about, it is what he said was correct. It was so obvious. It was concrete. What he was saying was totally concrete, and yet, obviously, from Sunanda's observation, many of us didn't get it or don't get it. So let's look at Doris, who's.
I do feel I was Krishna's biggest failure because I've known him as much as long as anybody anyway, and I've certainly studied him, I think, more than anybody. I've studied him morning, noon and night. I've really immersed myself in the teachings. And he once said that if you immersed yourself in the teachings, you couldn't fail to see an improvement every day. I haven't seen an improvement every day. I knew I should probably not see him again, and I wanted to take this opportunity of really coming into contact with him, to really exposing myself, really finding out about this Doris Pratt business. And I said to him, "Sir, I would like to, if I can, lay myself out on the table in front of you so that you can help me to see what I am." He at once jumped in at me almost sharply and said, "Miss Pratt, you're like all the rest of them. You come to me with a begging bowl." That really shocked me. It went right through my being. I saw it was true, that I was coming to him with a begging bowl. And I said after a moment or two, "I think I better go and think that over." He said, "Do just that." And with that, he got up and walked out of the room. That was the end of my interview. He didn't touch me on the shoulder. He didn't open the door for me. He just left me.
Now, you have to appreciate that Doris was there as the secretary of the Order of the Star in 1929, and this was just before Kay passed. So that's the duration that Doris had been studying the teachings day and night. It's almost 50 years. Now, of course, Kay was frustrated. I would be too. So let's look very quickly at these psychological forces that conspire to create the begging bowl. And the presence of the begging bowl blinds us to what Kay is talking about from a state-specific standpoint. We don't understand ourselves, as we've just been talking about. The pervasive and chronic default activity of psychological thought, a cup filled psychologically has no room for insight. Now, living in the house of mirrors, which is a distortion, creates all of the phobias and neuroses that we live with, which put us into those addictive states and the craving for various things, et cetera, what Gabor wrote about addiction in the realm of hungry ghosts. So this dominance of psychological thought and the fear and anxiety that is implicit there creates all the many physical and psychological disorders, as well as the predator. Psychological thought, or thought in general, failing to perceive its limits, as Achyut describes so beautifully. The other is hidden from the mind of image and concept. The other that Kay is talking about is hidden from the mind filled with images and concepts. So let's hear Bill Quinn explain what that means.
I've been asked the question as to whether Kay could be called a mystic. And I think he was, in every sense of the word, as used classically, you might say. This use of the term, by the way, has nothing to do with the popular use of the term. But in the strict orthodox use of the word, mysticism, in the Greek it meant hidden, simply hidden. But it meant specifically hidden to the mind of image and concept. In other words, indirectly, they were saying direct experience. The mystic is a man who perceives directly. And St. John of the Cross, one of the great exemplars of this tradition, had a beautifully clear image. He said, if I have my hand in front of my eyes, I cannot see the sun. If I have an image of God, I cannot see God. And it's as simple as that. So in this sense, Krishnamurti was a mystic.
Okay. So there's a couple more that this is so important. Concealment, right? Part of the nature of the psychological thought process is concealing its own behavior from itself. Because if it realized what it was doing, it couldn't do it with gusto, right? So implicit in this is concealment. Concealment, hiding it from ourselves is part of what blocks people from being able to see.
Think of the word self. Its basic meaning is the quintessence, the essence of all essences. And that would, of course, have supreme value. Now, if we assume there is a self and we feel that this stirs up the whole mind and brain inside, so it feels just from that assumption that something is going on inside, which corresponds to this assumed self and gives it an apparent reality. Now, once it has been assumed that this self is real and not merely an image, it's attributed reality, then everything becomes, it takes first priority and everything else comes second, so everything is distorted. It's because this image of the self, the concept of the self is assumed to be so all-important, the brain starts to develop a defense mechanism to defend this image against what we call, quote, apparently to defend the image against perception of its falseness or illusory character. You can see this very easily that if somebody says you are an idiot, there's an immediate response to say, I'm not an idiot. That it's painful to have an image of yourself as an idiot. Therefore, you say you're wrong, and you may start adopting all sorts of false explanations to show that you are okay and the other person is the idiot. But this is only a minor point compared with the tremendous energy that comes in when the very existence of this image is apparently threatened by some evidence that it's only an image, it's only an illusion. Then the entire brain starts to be disrupted, the brain and nervous system, and as a result, a defense mechanism comes in just to block it or to wipe it out or to turn attention somewhere else. Now, this defense mechanism, part of the defense is to make us unconscious of it. You see, the major form of defense is simply concealment of what's going on, because if we could see what's going on, it would be obvious it's an illusion. It's like seeing through the trick of the magician. So also, all the ways I've described, such as forgetting and zapping your mind or jumping to something else, are modes of concealment. You may also conceal by just denying that it's so and asserting something else. And therefore, we are not conscious we are not conscious certainly of the defense mechanism, because this process of concealment itself has to be concealed in order to make it effective. And therefore, the defense, the major part of the defense, consists in making the whole process unconscious.
So this helps us appreciate why Doris and most of us have a begging bowl. So to wrap up, because we only have a couple of minutes left, so this is a summary from Samdong Rinpoche of the entire Tibetan tradition. It's right here. This is the whole Shamola, right in one little neat package. So he said there's 3 practices that he called them. He called them meditations, but I'm going to use the word practice. One, or mindfulness, to be aware of. One is gathering attention or mindfulness. Obviously, this is a prerequisite because the thought process is so all-consuming that we are completely embedded in it. We are enchanted in it. Rarely are we aware of the process as the process is unfolding. So it requires a quality of energy and attention that is above what he called the reflex system. Most of what we consider to be thought is a reflex. It's just the pinball is hitting the things and it's going bling, and we call it wonderful. How smart am I? But in essence, it's just a reflex. And he noted that there's no intelligence really in a reflexive system. So you need to have enough energy and attention to rise above the reflex system, and only to that degree are you able to be free of the enchantment that the reflexes create. Clear? So gathering attention. Well, how often did Kay say that? I mean, that's quite at the root, right? Without that, you can't go anyplace. Nothing can be done. Gurdjieff's whole foundation started with the same thing, not being mechanical. So then comes this big middle ground. And Rinpoche said, we use the source of our disease, dis-ease, we use the source of our disease as medicine. And what did he mean by that? You use a very strict form of analytic self-dialogue to negate the false reality created by psychological thought. Do you see what I'm saying? And now this is a practice. So basically what you're doing is negating the ego. You're negating your ego. And in negating the ego, you're negating all the emotions and all of the racisms and all of the beliefs and all the judgments and all the comparisons and all of those attributes that we talked about that are implicit in psychological thought. We're negating those systematically. When that judgment comes up or when that image comes up, when I shift into the psychological realm, we negate it. Now, that's a big job because it's our whole life. We've had our whole life embedded in that reality. So basically what you're doing is negating that psychological thought realm and all of its attributes and all of the images and feelings that were in there. So now what if you did that? Now my caveat is, or my underscore of this is that in my view, fully, I don't know what percentage, but I'm going to say in the upper 90% of what Kay was talking about, the essence of those 250,000 pages of transcripts, his collected dialogues and talks, the vast majority of that is this middle ground. He was calling attention to and negating the false reality created by that psychological thought realm. Almost all the talks and things we're systematically dealing with that level. But then if you do that, what do you have? You've gathered all this energy and attention, and you're no longer wasting your life. Something that he said, you're wasting your life, sir. How are we wasting our life? We're wasting our life investing our precious energy and attention into chasing our tail, this false reality created by psychological thought. That's how we're wasting our life. But what if you didn't do that? What if you had all the energy that you've gathered and you're not distracted by the psychological thought realm, and of course, assuming the bonded brain, very important, then every action that you did would be a movement towards wholeness and compassion and empathic, appropriate right action. What else could you do? There's no other reality. You had no other reality but to move towards wholeness. And that is, I think, can you live a different way? And all of that fits nicely under being unconditionally free. Thank you. There were no time for questions. I'm happy to sit and visit and share because this may have raised issues for people. But please go on, but I'm happy to be available to explore any of these things.